Morbidly Beautiful presents a horror interview podcast hosted by Brody Hubbard. You have entered the chamber.
It's time once again for The Chamber on the Morbidly Beautiful Network. I'm your host, Brody Hubbard. The theme song is Itchin' for the Blood, a wonderful track by Lil Boudang out of Texas. And today's guest is from Pensacola, Florida. Her name is Kristin Garth. She's one of my favorite poets and prose writers. Her material does skew into very dark territory, so as to avoid triggers, let me warn you ahead of this interview, we do cover such topics as assault and abuse of women and children. We talk about violence, we talk about murder, and maybe you would expect no less from a horror podcast. However, Kristin isn't necessarily writing about demons or monsters, not in this particular collection anyway. This new compilation of short stories and novellas called Daddy is very much inspired by real life bad human beings that she met, scary and sketchy types, from her journey from a Puritan family to stripping to the writer that she is today. In this interview, I also refer to some stories from a previous collection called You Don't Want This, and there's a print interview that I had conducted with Kristin that is available on Meow Meow Pow Pow. I will make sure to share a link on the description to this episode. You can go to her Twitter profile at Lola and Jolie, or her Instagram profile, Kristin Ingrid Garth, or KristinGarth.com, which is the website for her own work and for her press called Pink Plastic House. And now welcome Kristin into the chamber. I really loved Daddy. I loved You Don't Want This. And so I'm sure there's other stuff that's been published. I know there's other stuff that's been published, even if it's individual pieces in different like lit journals and things like that between the two collections. But this is the first collection since then?
No, a collection. Yeah,
Okay.
I had a novel that came out in between called The Meadow, which had to do with BDSM and it was its own world, but it was based on my own that it was a novel, but it was very autobiographical. So about when I was younger and I traveled around and had some adventures.
Yeah.
So that came out in between these two short story books, but I had written it. A lot of my work, because I'm older, I'm not 20 years old, so I'm like I didn't start publishing until I was in my 40s. So the luxury of that is you have a lot of things sitting around that if you've been writing all that time but you're a recluse and you're not sharing it, you have a bunch of stuff that you can work on and get out into the world. And that was something I had been working on for a long time, and then I got the opportunity to finally put that out there, and I was really excited about it. But it was a longer form, and I really when I went to graduate school, I did a lot of sonnets. That's what I didn't graduate from graduate school. I was a dropout because I started stripping and I just got caught up in another world, and but it was a way out of like the puritanical life that I had lived before that, cutting off my family ties, and establishing myself financially. Instead of, I could have stayed in graduate school. I was privileged that they would have paid for that, but
Right.
I would have been under their control, you know what I'm saying? And so it was more important for me to do the other. But anyway, I did a lot of short stories then, and I did a lot of sonnets. And so it really feels good to be, now getting the short stories. Because at first I did, everybody kind of, I was pushing all my poetry a lot, I really love the short stories too.
I love your short stories as well. And seeing the novella Plaything, which is encapsulated in Daddy, it made me so happy to have you, particularly on this show, The Chamber, because the Morbidly Beautiful network that we're on, it primarily covers horror, and I knew that we were stepping a little bit out of the normal coverage by because you don't do strictly horror, but there is definitely a horror.
I consider it. To me, like that's yeah, I feel like I've lived a horror and been exposed. Not everything I write is about me, but like just I mean, there are a lot of the short stories in that book that are horrors that I maybe witnessed secondhand. The writing them, it's like processing, but yeah, I more like I guess realistic horror. I would say.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I think there was some things that were more allegorical and fantastical in You Don't Want This, like specific stories. But whereas, and I said at the time in my review that, and it was a review blurb, and also like we did an interview at the time in print for Meow Meow Pow Pow, which I was an editor at, and I said that you cover this underbelly that's very America, whether people want to admit that it's America or not, it is.
Very Florida, where I'm from. I would say very Florida.
Yes, very Florida, USA. And there's that, but you're able to go fantastical with Daddy. I feel like it is all very much so grounded. The stories, the straight up prose like narratives are very much grounded in reality, but there's murderers, there's abusers and predators for sure. And there's I'm thinking of one story in particular where and you'll have to help me kind of I don't know how much we want to interpret it or not for the audience who hasn't read it yet, but I'm thinking of the one where I'll edit the part where I'm stumbling for the title. It was a woman in kind of on an estate. Oh, it had to do with the retiree. Was that Drakina?
Oh, Florida Drakana. Yes, and Florida Drakana. Yeah.
and there's some I interpret it kind of as vague as to how she got into that. Not vague, but maybe there's some questions as to how she got in this situation where I mean somebody's missing.
Definitely a stripper that he had met, and I mean I knew a lot of like when I was a stripper. That story, I live out in the woods. There's some elements that I kind of live that kind of life where I'm out in the woods and I have a lot of privacy and all that, but that's about the end of that story. But I met a lot of people when I was stripping, and I would meet these very young girls. Like I was 25 when I started stripping, even though I was like the school girl. Like a lot of the girls who looked older than me at that time were like 18, barely legal, all that. And so, and you would see them come and they'd be there for like a month or two. And I was there for 5 years. So I saw a lot of those type of people that would just disappear. They'd meet some customer and they would disappear, and you always kind of wonder, like what happened to them and, whatever. Cause, and so that was, sort of based on that, and like the idea of being in control of someone like that, and domestic violence, and also just I don't know, it was it was fun to like go to a dark place of a character that just not tolerated anymore, you know what I mean, that won't
Yeah, she reminded me a lot of what I think people are expecting from Ty West's MAXXXINE that will be coming out, because and I don't know how familiar you are with that series of of X and then Pearl and then MAXXXINE.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I was thinking about how, so with X, you have these adult porn star people or aspiring stars, but they're definitely working in pornography, and they without spoiling it for people who haven't seen it,
I haven't. I've been told to watch it, many times, and I haven't seen it,
yeah.
yet. So.
Well, they're living a very, libertine lifestyle. It's 70s porn, right? And they encounter, we'll just say, homicidal forces. And then, Pearl goes way back in time to kind of examine how that farm they were on, and some of those homicidal forces came to be. But MAXXXINE really picks up the story with the gal, and she's going to try to survive this new life in LA, but she's hardened by the experiences from the first movie we've seen.
Yeah.
And you know, there are a lot of movies that involve a lot of horror that involves, you know, dancers, adult film stars, and there's like an outwardly force that they collide with, whereas you're dealing with the actual, like you said, horrors of what happens in that scene. And
Yeah.
in
And also inside a person, like I think all of my stories, you know, like you were saying something to me before when you were talking about doing this interview about like what scares you. And I think mostly why I did this book when I was thinking about that is that like maybe I scare myself, you know what I'm saying? Like, and that's how I, you know, because of, you know, I see like, I have an abuse history, like I was abused, but the people who abused me have even worse history than I had, but they have like no self-awareness at
right.
all, you know? And I've always had a self-awareness, you know, I always, and that, you know, honed into my writing, you know, and I think that that saves you from like, you know, becoming a dark person yourself. You know what I'm trying to say? Having like awareness of like, you know I have these issues and I know I need to keep myself in check. You know what I mean? And like maybe that's how my writing does that for me, you know, is like I put any kind of, you know, like writing that story about Florida Chicano. It's like, you know, I just listened the other day to the Lyle Menendez, you know, and he was doing an interview in jail because there's a whole lot of evidence that they may end up getting out of jail finally because you know, they've got a lot of evidence now that his father molested him, which is what they always said, you know.
Yeah.
But and I'm not advocating still how they handled it, you know what I'm saying? But I stripped with a girl who shot her father, who molested her, and she got off. She was a dancer that I worked with. That it was really small, tiny. Nobody messed with her because everyone knew, like, you know, she had a reputation. But sweetest girl. But you know what I'm saying? She had enough. You know what I mean? Like, and not that but it just feels good sometimes to exercise those kind of demons of like letting yourself go there in a story, you know, of someone who has wronged you, you know, and it's horrible, you know.
So do you think it wouldn't be a leap then that perhaps the same catharsis is found by readers and viewers, the audience for these books and films that cover these dark topics?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's definitely I write. That's you know, the most important reason I write is catharsis and therapy. I used to go to therapy when I was younger, and I don't really now. And I really consider my writing, you know, that does that for me, you know. So that's always, I guess that's why I have a different like outlook about, you know, some people that, you know, will talk to me and they're very like they know all their numbers of how much, you know, they make, or you know what, I don't worry about all that, you know, because like the important thing to me, like I'm so excited about this book just because I know it's so brave, you know what I'm saying? Like you know, hey, like I always want to be like coming, you know, leading with my weakness, you know what I'm saying? But you know, which is a scary thing because people can also use it against you, you know.
Yeah. And that happens a lot in these stories too. There's very vulnerable young women who, you know, that's definitely one of the recurring themes, and it makes sense with the name Daddy and what that invokes in our culture. You know, it's less innocent than, you know, outside.
It should, yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
you know, but
Yeah. Like, outside of families, sometimes, you know, and sometimes inside of families it can be a very dark thing too, but these specifically are like, you know, well-off men with or without their own trauma who are preying upon
you know, like Florida Daddy was important to me because that's a character, you know, I let somebody read that before and they were, you know, completely, I think that's one that like, you know, this person was like, oh my God, like, you know, like they, you know, did not, you know, it triggered them, I think. But it triggered me because I knew this man. Like I used to be a court reporter. And when I was a court for a short time after I was a stripper, and I worked with this lawyer who turned out to be this man that were, you know, in the story. And like, I used to like casually, you know, make little, you know, conversation with this guy who was flying off to go do terrible things to children, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, and got caught in a sting for that, and hung himself in prison after he was caught,
Yeah.
but was a soccer coach, had a family, complete double life, seemed like the most boring man in the world to me, like that's how it would have, characterized him,
Yeah.
and it was like, I write something like that because it's just like, to this day, you know what I mean? Like, it gets me that I didn't pick up, you know what I mean? Because I feel like I have a radar of that, but I did not have a radar at all, you know what I mean? Like, and so I wrote that story I did a bunch of research about facts about his case, after he passed away. And anyway.
And that's the thing, and that's and I'll tread on this topic delicately. I would just say that I feel like now as an adult, in this modern age, we're seeing like one of the first portrayals of that I recall was Kiefer Sutherland in Freeway, which was like the
Yeah, like that's
Red
definitely
Red
great.
Riding Hood allegory, Big Bad Wolf allegory.
Yes.
And then finding out like horrible things he was into and doing. But I mean, there's been other movies like that, but in real life, with everybody from like that kid from Glee to
Oh yeah.
the Subway guy, like there's all these more high
Yeah,
profile.
people that you just don't see it. Even people you think, like, if you are self-aware and you have been through it, you think, well, at least I have this armor of like experience, you know what I'm saying? And I would, and not that like I mean, I didn't know this person besides doing depositions with him, you know what I'm saying? But I did not, I mean, I was, like, knocked me over, shocked, you know what I'm saying? Like, when I found out, he hung himself and after being caught in a sting for, going to see a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
That's what he thought. I mean, it was all a sting. There was no 5-year-old, but he didn't know that,
Yeah. And that brings to mind something else I wanted to talk to you about, because I feel like horror fans and horror there's kind of this I don't know if you would call it like a sister genre or a weird cousin genre, but like of true crime.
Yeah, and I read and watch a lot of true crime.
so
And
that yeah. Those go hand in hand to you. I would imagine. It feels like to me, even like some of the vendors I see at the conventions I go to and stuff, like there's horror merchandise. So there's also very much like true crime merchandise. It doesn't even have to be specifically like a T-shirt of Ed Gein, which I actually had as a teenager. But like just celebrating the fact, like we're interested in sitting down and listening to a podcast about a dark case, and while we
just like a play thing you were talking about, like the character, she's in the middle of it. She's living in a true crime. She has but for entertainment, she's reading, and her whole, all she wants is to be safe in life, and that's why she moves in with this man who turns out to be, not a good guy. And and she's reading her true crime at night, but she's living, you know what I mean? Like reading the true crime going, oh, see, I'm not living that, but she is living that, you know what I mean? Like it. And I think that's been my own, worries at times. Like, even if you're self-aware, you know what I mean? Like, even if you're, whatever, it's like, it's never enough, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and and you do have issues that, that those needs, like that whole, if you do have daddy issues, which I think always is attribute, like, or often in our culture, it's like, oh, it's like a damaged girl, you know what I'm saying? But nobody is talking about, the father that, you know what I'm trying to say? It's like, yes, I mean, you crave this thing that is like a basic human need,
And what I think I am also hearing you say is we might focus on these girls, but we don't examine enough the men in their lives who impacted them. And
yeah.
One thing I know from your writing is go ahead.
Men that use those issues to prey on girls too.
Right.
I mean, that's what I always had. That's what I enjoyed about being a, being a schoolgirl stripper, whatever, was that felt like I was preying on the men who were preying on the girls with the daddy issues, trying to say it felt kind of like, okay, you know what I mean?
That make it easier too. I know that it's something you've done more of, and we had talked about this in our previous chat, was writing from the point of view of that predator. And
oh yeah. And a little bit in play. I did a part of the novella, which I don't know how successful I am at it, but but no, I feel like I those characters pretty well,
Yeah, see, and that's a thing that's talked about in, let's say film, so much of it is that our point of view stays with the victims, the survivors, as they're trying to outrun this menace. But there are those kind of standout films that really do show it from the perspective of the killer, from the bad, person, the scary force. And so, and I feel like you can get away with that more in literature. And it's one of the things I was thinking of when reading some of this, is that there is a lot of, I was in an MFA program, and so I had to read a lot. And since I've been out of that MFA program, I've been a terrible reader. It's why I don't often take the book review gigs, because I'm just bad at getting the reading done. For years, like excited, did it, love to read it.
I was so happy to read it,
and it just reminded me of like, what I'm missing out on and what people are missing out on, because you can really dig into not only the deep details of multiple points of view, but I look at something that became viral the last couple months, was Aron Beauregard's Playground. People were just like astonished at this extreme horror novel.
I'm not familiar with that either. So,
yeah. So, I mean, it's a really basic premise, like it kind of like a Squid Game kind of deal. It's like, okay, we're going to have these kids come and they're going to try to survive this terrible playground. But like, there's so much more to it that as far as like, it's very grisly and visceral. And, there's some sexual details in there as well. People are like, oh man, page 40. Oh God. Like that's the thing that was going viral. So, while you're not writing extreme horror, you are still getting into details and way, way, way beneath the surface level that sometimes, a low budget movie, for instance, you only got so much time and so much you can do with a cast on a film, depending on your budget. You can really dig in deep and really slow down the narrative. And that kind of happens with Plaything, because there's, as far as time jumps or like really examining what's happening over the course of one night, as opposed to over the course of 5 years. So, and you mentioned like you were in that club dancing for 5 years. So it's just wild for me to imagine like how much can happen in that amount of time.
Yeah. I mean, like I danced for, I was about to say he's on death row, but he just got taken out. He just appealed. But I used to dance for a guy who was on death row. Now he's in appeal. So I think he's going to get life forever, but he, you know what I'm saying? Like the people that you meet in a strip club,
Yeah. And just and you're able to, from these points of view,
a different side of, because it's in a contained environment that, that you, in some way you're in a bubble with them that they can do very little, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And it's almost like a therapist, like for a lot of them that come in there. I mean, it's like they maybe somebody who wouldn't go to a therapist, but this is what they do instead. They go and they get some table dances, and then they like spill their, psychological issues to you.
So you're able to draw from that, and you're able to write from a bunch of different points of view over a bunch of different timelines, and even decades. I felt there was a previous story in about like this girl who's like in like the dance mom culture.
Oh yeah, and you don't want this. The one about, yes, I and that yes.
And I'm sure there's still Dance Moms and stuff, and there might even still be some of those Dance Mom shows. But I remember that
time. But that was like when I was at that, because when I was stripping, it was at that, during that time.
You have a story that starts out with these twins getting a gig at a roller skate rink, and that to me, intentionally or not, just invoked, like, and you'll have to remind me what timeline it is. There's nothing that I recall standing out particularly about technology that it could have been 70s, 80s, 90s, but
yeah, that's when I grew up. So,
Right. So I remember, but I mean, I still was, at Moonlight Rollerway in Burbank, some with folks, friends having fun.
But that was, I worked with a lot of girls who would pretend to be twins when we would get girls coming through all the time. We never had any actual twins, but we had girls who looked close enough that they would pretend, and they would always, make so much money, but so that's where I somewhat got the idea of that story, because, and also the story of the Shannon twins. I at the Playboy Mansion, I was reading a lot about them and watching about their documentary and things that they did when they were younger, and how they were always capitalizing on, being cute twins, like even in their hometown, like working at a sports bar together, and,
See, it's funny because there's that, but I think of in horror that like twins are always portrayed as creepy, like going back to Shining.
Yeah, Shining twins.
Definitely popped out since then. I feel like there those gals who were in the movie Peaches Christ made. Gosh, Peaches Christ, the drag queen who ended up making a horror movie with Natasha Lyonne and Cassandra Peterson, who's Elvira. Why is the name escaping me? All About Evil. It was kind of like a takeoff on All About Evil.
Like, yeah.
There's some scary sisters in that. So, what kind of horror have you been reading or watching? Like, as somebody who
I just Barbarian recently. I mean, just like that's the last horror film that I had watched that I thought was so good, and just I loved how it, showed like the whole town, how it affected everything, just it was really good on so many levels, I thought,
yeah,
but it's so creepy.
that's a Kristin Garth story in Detroit instead of Pensacola, I feel like.
To an extreme, yes. Yeah. But I totally loved that. It was like, and then I think in the same 48-hour period, I watched Barbarian, and what was the other one? There's another, gosh, it was about the boy. His mother goes crazy, and his mother's like slowly going crazy, and it's all like from a little boy's perspective. It was very triggering to me because it was like, because I can't think of the name. It was like an Australian movie.
It sounds like The Babadook, but I haven't actually.
Yes. Okay. Yes. That's what it was. And it was that movie really got to me because it was like, you just feel so much for this little child, and it was to me like a realistic horror, because it's like, I mean, although in the movie you think, she's not, whether or not she's going crazy or, I think it's a metaphor to me is how I saw it, that this, this mental illness that she can contain, you know what I mean? That's how I guess looking at it from parents who, I grew up in like a house where psychology was considered like evil. You would never go to a therapist. You cannot take psychological medications. And I had two extremely depressed parents, suicidally depressed. So, it was a lot of fun, you know what I mean? But like, I totally relate to, that feeling of like, these people that are in control of me are losing their mind, you know what I mean? And like, I got to protect my love. I still have feelings for them, and I still, as a child, but I have to protect myself from them as much as possible, even in this house where I live,
Right. And that's another interesting thing I think about, what I would call modern horror. Some folks call elevated horror, but I think of specific A24 films where it's like really looking at horror coming home, and not in the sense of a slasher coming into the suburbs with a mask on, or and not in the sense of like
monster that you live that lives next door, and that your parents talk to, or that is your parent, or you know what I mean, or saying like the monster that doesn't look like a monster that everybody trust. Like, I mean, I had, again, like stripping, I had a customer that was like philanthropist of like the town I'm living in, worked on like children's charities and everything else, and was one of my customers who was like very, very dark, to the point like, I mean, I continued to take, the money from him in the club, but it was, triggering beyond, degrading, completely opposite, what everyone in the town believes that this man is, and I mean, so that, that's the kind of monster, that like you're going to run into walking downtown and the mayor is going to shake his hand, you know what I mean? And like, hey, and, could do anything to you. And no one will believe you,
Yeah. And I think one of the takeaways from this, like, I mean, whether it's somebody who, like myself, who is really familiar with your work and has interviewed you and read other interviews and can connect some dots. And you've said like, hey, these experiences aren't all me, but I'm not saying, I wasn't involved in some of it. Like, I think the takeaway from your work when you cover some of these topics is like, for a reader who picks up the book for the first time, this is very real. Even if you want to pretend this is a dark scenario that an author has come up with to entertain you for the length of the time you're reading this story, like, know that this is happening. Is that
like, and there's always at least a seed of truth in all, at least I'd say in all of my stories. Like, they didn't all happen to me, and they didn't all maybe end the way, like the story about the movie star father, is
right. Oh no, sorry, that's a different one. Okay, I do want to talk about Conman, but let's talk about the one with the movie star father. Yes,
the plan, that is a story that I happen to know, from somebody in my town who has a very famous father who, funds their life, but didn't have anything to do with them. And like, I was told this story and it was just like, what, you know what I mean? Like, and they were desperate, a lot of, but it didn't ever, to my knowledge, didn't end the way my story ends in that. But I, that was the writer in me that was like, because I just felt so much for this person's dad, again, imagine that this person used to like watch all this person's movies, who was incredibly famous and has that's how they knew their father, when they sit down and like, I'm going to watch this, great one tonight, you know what I mean? And
yeah.
And it was just such a, they stick with me, and like, and then, and it, speaks to something in me that I feel. And so, anyway.
I before we do go, I just have to point out how much I love the title Con Man, because it's about a convention and con.
Yeah.
I just thought, I know that's a small thing to point out, but I thought it was very clever, and I loved that.
Yeah, I thought it worked out well, because I actually, yes, thank you.
And this is about an experience that a young woman has with an actor, much like any of the actors that any of us who go to horror conventions or other kind of fandom conventions, might run into. And he's not the hero of the story. We'll just say that. But
no.
There are a few heroes that pop up, especially in Plaything, and so the book is called Daddy. It's coming out on Anxiety Press, and it's, as we said, there's some
very soon.
Yes, there's some turns of phrase on there, some sonnet poem, but there's also, like we said, the short stories, and then the last third or half, I would say, of the book is the novella Plaything, which is, as we alluded to, is about what happens when you
give in to your daddy issue, you know what I mean? And it's just like, they, okay, you know what I mean? And like, and, you know, and, you know, put your blinders on and.
Kristin Garth, thank you for entering the chamber today.
Thank you for having me.